Well, hi there. It's great to join you this afternoon as I speak to my friend Michael Swain from the organization Freedom of Religion South Africa, an organization which works to protect and promote your freedom of religion in our country. Michael, I really always enjoy speaking to you. You bring wonderful insight on pressing topics that often we don't get to consider in detail, and you give us the opportunity to pause and reflect a little bit on things that are important. This week, we're going to be talking about a coalition of religious organizations who are meeting with the Minister of Education to express concerns about a teacher training program known as the Early Childhood Education Toolkit. Now, I got to tell you, Michael, a lot of people are talking about this. A lot of people have been engaging about this. I was with a group of homeschoolers just a few weeks ago, and this was the topic of education. The topic of conversation was education. So I know that there will be a number of people that listen to this podcast who are really concerned and have perceptions about what's happening. I'm looking forward to you bringing some clarity. So maybe just tell us the background to this meeting. Who are the members of the coalition, and why has this coalition been formed?
Well, the coalition is actually probably one of the most significant, let's say, consolidations of religious organizations that we have yet seen. It met previously on two occasions with the Department of Basic Education to basically express the concern that a department within the DBE has developed and is rolling out a program that applies to pre-primary and primary school learners, which will really teach them by creating a culture of transgenderism, a very biased view, of course, on sex and gender. And many parents obviously will not approve or endorse this. And I think critically, obviously, as parents know, whatever is taught to children, especially in the early lives of their development, will profoundly influence how they navigate and interact with the world for the rest of their lives. And therefore, obviously, families must be actively engaged. It should go without saying, but it unfortunately doesn't, that the law is very clear that the primary educators of children are their parents. And it's parents who have the rights and responsibility to decide what is in the best interest of their children, which, by the way, also includes deciding what religious beliefs and cultural practices to teach their children, both at home and at school. So this coalition has come together really on this common cause because every culture, every faith has a very similar view of this type of thing. And it represents, among others, the United Ulama Council of South Africa. They represent probably about 2 to 3 million people from the Islamic faith. It includes the South African Community of Faith-Based Fraternals and Federations called SACOF, which has about probably I understand, over 16,500 churches, probably also representing plus minus 5 million people. Then you have the Nkululeko Yazizwe Association, which represents a huge number of the traditional African spirituality churches. And they represent probably close to 10 million people. And then, of course, also, last but not least, the Alliance of, or the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa, that's TISA. And they represent many of the denominations. And also by association, of course, both SACOF, which has a seat on the SACC, and TISA, also the SACC are very much aware of this issue. So very significant religious groupings, very much united in their concern about this education development.
Michael, it doesn't surprise me that across the board, folk recognize the right, the inalienable right that parents have in regards to their own children. That's certainly afforded to us in the scriptures. And so it doesn't surprise me that it's recognized by such a wide grouping of people, and even is legislated in our constitution, a protected right in our country. But maybe you can kind of get in a little bit in terms of what this ECE toolkit is. How was it formed, and why is this coalition so concerned about it?
Yeah, well, the first engagement that we had was in 2023. This ECE toolkit, its actual full name is the Gender Responsive Pedagogy for Early Childhood Education Toolkit. This was funded, at least in part, by a 40 million rand grant by a Belgian-based organization called VVOB. And it was developed by a directorate, a unit that's been set up within the DBE called the Social Inclusion and Equity in Education Directorate. And the University of Stellenbosch were also involved in it. Now, some of the materials and training that the department or the unit within it has developed are almost, a simple reading, marginalizing and even excluding the constitutionally protected views and values of parents. And although this unit is called the Social Inclusion and Equity in Education Unit, instead of an inclusive approach, which obviously would take into account and reasonably accommodate diversity of views, these materials and the training programs present basically a single and arguably a radical and controversial ideology on sexuality and gender. So the coalition is firstly disturbed by the content of it, but most importantly, the age of the children which this is targeting. And obviously this will in many cases be completely antithetical to the views and values held by the vast majority of their parents, who hold more traditional cultural and faith-based understanding. So that was the motivation to engage with the department, in the hope that there would be an openness to hear and understand these very legitimate concerns. Now, I think it's probably worthwhile saying, of course, that the department is facing very real challenges that it is trying to resolve. And we don't go there in a sort of a combative role. We go there really to try and be part of the solution, but very clear in our view that the solution that is being proposed in the form of this toolkit is not going to help fix the problems that they claim that it will, which are specifically gender-based violence and femicide, and also bullying in schools.
Michael, you mentioned a couple of meetings with the Department of Basic Education. Maybe give us some examples of what the coalition is concerned about in the ECE toolkit. And then also help us, give us some input or some outcomes of those meetings that you had with the Department of Basic Education.
Well, our initial meeting was in December 2023, and we had a follow-up meeting in March this year. And we presented a comprehensive position paper, which primarily, of course, sets out the legal framework of the rights of parents as the primary educators of their children, and those who are obviously best positioned to act in the best interests of their children. And we were very concerned with this material because, as I said, and to give you maybe just some illustrations, it trains teachers to set up this culture, as we see it, of transgenderism in primary schools. So we're talking about little kids here. We're talking about, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. And it asks them, for example, little Johnny, like, what's your preferred name? What's your preferred pronoun? What toilet would you like to use or choose? And the program also instructs teachers to no longer use he, she pronouns in the classroom. They're rather supposed to use they, them. And the purpose of this, according to the training, is to reinforce the view that you cannot, and they want children to realize, you cannot tell whether a person is a boy or a girl or a man or a woman simply by looking at them. And teachers are further told to tell children that if their parents have been teaching them differently, they're actually harming them and holding them back in life. Now, obviously, that is a very serious situation because it potentially drives that wedge between parents and their children, which cannot be in their best interest. And also, I think, very significantly, potentially between parents and their teachers. And education is dependent upon there being a good relationship between the parents and the teachers in the education system. So we did have a meeting with them in the last 2 meetings, and we were very disturbed by their response. They actually told us, for example, that they believed that the Constitution and the law allowed them to supplant parental authority as it saw fit. And it didn't need either permission or cooperation or buy-in from parents. They specifically said that parents can teach their children whatever values they want, but that they have the right to supplement those values with what they referred to as constitutional principles. They told us that they see the parent-child relationship as an unequal power dynamic, excuse me, and therefore that they are obviously now seeing themselves as somehow the champions of the children. I mean, that is obviously wrong in law and completely counterproductive. So we were very concerned. We took the decision that we would wait until post-election. We didn't want to make it an election issue, but we have then been pressing the DBE for a meeting, and we did in fact have a meeting yesterday at Parliament with the Minister of Education, and we were very clear to make sure that she clearly understood, the new minister, the legitimate issues and concerns, and to also make sure that she would give them the proper consideration.
I mean, I'm listening to you. It's bizarre. I'm infuriated. I'm a parent of a 21-year-old and a 19-year-old and a 10-year-old. I love my children, and I see this as an encroachment on the family unit. It just sounds so bizarre. What on earth is, from your opinion anyway, motivating this? Why is the Department of Basic Education so insistent that this program must continue to be rolled out? It sounds bizarre. And it sounds, I mean, surely this can't ultimately be in their political interest. What's motivating them?
Well, the rationale that they have given us, and again, we're waiting now for a more detailed response, but the rationale that they originally gave us is that somehow this teaching and training of children in this particular ideology will help to deal with bullying. Now, they seem to conflate the notion that parents who hold traditional views on sex and sexuality are somehow also encouraging their children to bully those who hold different views. Well, I mean, number one, it's obviously unfair, it's inaccurate, and it's disingenuous to posit that parents' genuine concerns about this type of teacher training and what's going to be then passed on to their children in sex education are somehow linked to in support of the fact that they're teaching their children to be bullies. I mean, that is, as I think you said, absurd. Obviously, there is a problem of bullying in schools, but again, you have to ask the question: will this toolkit solve the problem in any way, shape, or form? You know, if one of the purposes as well of and the outcomes that they hope is to prevent gender-based violence and femicide, how can it possibly succeed if children are taught that there's actually no way of telling if somebody is a man or a woman? You know, and most gender-based violence is, of course, perpetrated by men against women, and femicide, by definition, is the murder of a woman or girl, in particular by a man and on account of her gender. So if you can't identify what a woman is, or if anybody can be a woman, then obviously the basis for protecting women's rights, including safe spaces, etc., just ceases to exist. So, you know, this promotion of this transgender ideology through this toolkit to really deeply confuse little children actually risks entrenching the very things that they claim that it's going to solve. So these were the points that we made at our meeting with the minister.
Well, tell us a little bit about the meeting with the minister. You had that yesterday, if I understood you correctly. Any outcomes, brother? Anything to give us hope, or is it a continual spiral downward?
No, well, look, I actually was very, and I think everybody who attended was very pleased by the very open-hearted response and the willingness on behalf of the new Minister of Basic Education to listen to the concerns. Obviously, she's coming in new, she's unaware of the history, and so we were able to bring her up to speed with that. And very importantly, she was open to considering the requests that were made by the coalition. You know, particularly the two major ones was obviously that the department should stop this teacher training course immediately. There should be a moratorium upon it until, at the very least, parents have had the opportunity to see what it entails and to give comment on that. In other words, a full public participation process, we believe, is needed. And the DBE have historically claimed, of course, it's not. They say, well, it's just teacher training and you don't have to give that open for parental comment. But the question, of course, like, what are you teaching and who are you teaching? And if the answer is they're teaching a transgender ideology and they're teaching our children, well, obviously, parents have the right to know what's going on. So that was the first and major issue that we raised. And secondly, we are proposing that just as there is this social equity and inclusion in education unit set up within the DBE, that they also set up a family values and parental rights unit so that true representation of diverse views and values are properly considered whenever the DBE is developing whatever it's a bill or a policy or a regulation, protocol, guideline, advisory toolkit, whatever, that those diverse views are properly considered and taken into account, obviously, in the drafting. So we envisage that this family values and parental rights unit will draw from members of communities and organizations who are dedicated to upholding the constitutional rights of religious and cultural communities, and obviously of all people, because, whichever view you have the right to be reasonably accommodated. But of course, we're not seeing, I think, in this teacher training toolkit, any attempt at having a sort of diversity. It really verges towards a conformity and a very single ideology is being pushed. And of course, we believe that that is unlawful. And obviously, there needs to be a change of direction.
Michael, I'm very glad that you were able to represent the interests of, well, certainly the people that I'm hoping will be listening to this podcast. And I want to commend the work of Freedom of Religion South Africa. Thank you for what you do. I know that that you do absolutely everything that you can, and that there is always so much more that you could do. Could I take a brief opportunity to tell people how they could get involved in supporting the work of Freedom of Religion South Africa? You can go to the website, FORSA, that's forsa.org.za. And other than a whole lot of other information on this topic and other topics, you can subscribe to their newsletter. And very importantly, you'll find mechanisms on that site for you to donate and get involved in partnering with Freedom of Religion South Africa. Michael, from me to you, thank you so much for what you guys do. And I do trust that the Lord continues to strengthen you in the work. Every blessing.
Thank you, Mark. It's always great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity.